This little informational meeting to order. Is this information, do we need to take roll this morning? No, we don't. I don't think we need to take roll. Most of us are here except those who aren't.
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe we need to take roll as you won't be taking any actions.
Yeah, we're not going to be taking any action. Also, just by way of info, this is an informational meeting for JAC to receive some information and follow up on some questions that's related to various issues on COVID funding and other issues affecting the health and incomes of Wyoming workers and their families. We're taking information from various agencies, but we're not going to have a public session where we're actually open this to the public and allow questions. But we certainly welcome anybody who's attending and hope that this is informative for all of us. So with that, do we have a batting order, Karen? Are we going to start with? Are we going to start with my first inclination is we'd start with elected officials and then go to cabinet level directors. But I'm getting the head shake from one of our elected officials. I guess she just is here to listen as well. So with that, why don't we go ahead? I see Lynn. They're up there. Welcome, Lynn. Is there any? Have you guys talked among yourselves? Do you have any particular order that you want to talk to us in?
Mr. Chairman, I would love to give you a little bit of background to start off with, if that would be all right.
Blythe, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of
Lynn,
the committee.
can I interrupt you just for a, can you
yes.
see if you can pull your mic just a little closer?
Yep.
Or your computer with your screen. That we can also, you can fill up the screen with your face, but we'll be able to hear you better.
All right, and I will try to speak up as well. Thank you. I wanted to give you a little bit of background as to where we were, how we got to where we are today. Our office is the state administrative agent for FEMA grants. We manage preparedness, mitigation, and disaster grants in this role on a daily basis. Disaster grants reimburse eligible applicants for expenses incurred during a disaster. We're the recipient of the disaster grant funding based on eligible expenses. We then reimburse the subrecipients, which can be towns or counties or other eligible applicants. Then we draw down that amount from the obligated FEMA funding to reimburse the state for that payment to the subrecipient. Normally, these grants are related to natural events, not a pandemic. For instance, the flooding that occurred in 17 counties in 2011 resulted in a disaster with 45 subrecipients, including counties, towns, cities, special districts, and state agencies, with multiple projects for each entity. Over the last 10 years, our agency has managed 11 federally declared disasters totaling more than $25 million. We have experience in this and are comfortable managing these disaster grants. It's what we do. But then came a pandemic. A health disaster is very different than a natural disaster. This requires us to work with state agencies that we have not historically worked with before in this capacity. There's a potential for all of the subrecipients I mentioned above, plus hospitals. We identified a lack of bandwidth to manage that many subrecipients. FEMA's #1 concern is duplication of benefits. 2 or more federal funding sources paying for the same expense. Normally, that's not a problem because we're just dealing with FEMA funds. This disaster has multiple sources of funding and some of it going directly to the subrecipients. Also, there's a concern for the increased complexity in funding and the number of possible subrecipients that would be new to FEMA. In all of this, our day-to-day work is still going on. We're assisting the Department of Health with the pandemic, as well as managing 6 other grants with applications due in March to May timeframe. So we turn to Hagerty. They have a vast amount of experience with FEMA. They're accustomed to working with states that have large, complex disasters, and such as hurricanes and other things. So we saw this as an opportunity to utilize their experience to help us ensure no duplication of benefits that could lead to deobligation of FEMA funding. There also is an opportunity for us to learn from them and have them assist with those agencies new to FEMA. As you know, the 2020 CARES Act funding was 100% federal funding. FEMA funding is normally a 75-25 non-federal split. However, this funding, the CRF funding, can be used to fund that 25% match as well. So while we were all working to ensure we did not return the CRF funds, we're also looking at the different criteria for the eligibility for these two types of funding, which was also changing as the pandemic progressed. At this point, it was logical to utilize CRF funding, which is the 100% funding, first. We were also working with some subrecipients already who had begun their project development and reimbursement process with FEMA, and we have already actually distributed some funds to those subrecipients. Then the rules changed again. The CRF deadline for expending those funds was extended, and FEMA reimbursements went to 100%, retroactively to January of 2020. That gave us an opportunity to further evaluate FEMA eligible expenses that were previously paid for with CRF funds. Those eligible expenditures could then be turned into FEMA for reimbursement, freeing up the CRF dollars of equal value to be reapplied to eligible projects. Management and administrative funds, figured at 7% of the eligible disaster expenditures, are available to fund our work with Hagerty and any other costs associated with managing the FEMA disaster funding. We've invited some members of the Hagerty team here today to talk more about our work with them and their work with other state agencies for this disaster. I believe Mark O'Mara or Matt Hochstein will be presenting on behalf of Hagerty.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Lynn? Okay, thank you, Lynn. Let's go on. So we saw, let's go ahead and we saw Mark up there a minute ago. Mark, if you want to come back and we'll just cue this up and keep going. Good morning, Mr. O'Mara. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm very well. Thank you, Director Budd. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the committee for having us. We're excited to speak with you this morning and to answer your questions. What we would like to do is start off with a brief overview of the work that's done to date, and then we can get into some of the specifics and answer some of the questions that you may have, if that suits your desire.
Sure, go ahead.
Great. And with that, I'm going to turn it over, Karen, to Matthew Hochstein. He's going to start with the presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you. Matthew, go ahead. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to be here. As Mark said, we have prepared a brief of our analysis to date and would like to walk you through that if that would be helpful. If not, we can certainly go to questions and answers, but I will be able to move through this relatively quickly, and it'll give you a nice foundation for our analysis and how where the state of Wyoming is currently in the recovery.
Thank you. And if you would, I don't know if it's if you've got them organized, but after you present those, is there any way, if you've got them outlined or something, if you could forward those to us, if they're in any kind of presentable fashion, that would just help us remember and be able to translate, to transfer the knowledge among others we talked to about what we learned today. So thank you.
Sure. Yep. So I think I saw when we were.
We do have
the deck that might be in front of you. Mm-hmm. And I'll go ahead and
right there. Yes. That's the one.
Fantastic. All right. So I will try to go ahead and share my screen if I'm able to. I know I've been doing Zoom long enough in COVID that sometimes it is locked, but it looks like I'm able to do that. So can you all see my screen now?
Yes. If you go ahead and put it on presentation form. There you go. Thank you.
Perfect. So before I do work through this material, I would like to go ahead and introduce just a real quick brief on Hagerty so that you understand who we are and why we are working with the state of Wyoming, and then introduce the team that you have in front of me, or in front of you, excuse me, so that you understand our backgrounds. So just very quickly about Hagerty Consulting, we are an emergency management and homeland security consulting firm. Have been operating since right after 9/11, where the firm was founded and started by Steve Hagerty. Our mission is to help our clients prepare for, recover from, respond to, and mitigate future disasters. That is all we do and what we specialize in across the country. Since being found as a firm, we have managed over $40 billion now in federal disaster grants across FEMA, HUD CDBG, which is a community development block grant program, and other federal disaster grants that are made available after a Stafford Act declaration. As it relates to COVID-19, we have been servicing clients across the country. Specifically to this conversation, I would just like to note that we are working with 9 different states in various forms related to COVID-19 support. A lot of that is related to what we're talking about today in forms of cost recovery. And right now we're helping states navigate a little over $5 billion across those 9 states in federal disaster funds. So hopefully that's a little context about Hagerty and our areas of expertise. My name is Matt Hochstein. I'm a vice president at the firm. Have been here over a decade now, and on top of a 20-year career in management consulting. Currently, I am serving as a project executive on many of our COVID contracts, but I have also served on many of our large-scale recoveries. Hagerty services the state of California following the wildfires of 2018 and 2020. I was one of the first members of that team in getting that project stood up to help that state recover. Also working in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria with the largest private nonprofit there, which is a $300 million operation and recovery. And then I'm leading the state of Maryland's recovery in COVID, which includes cost recovery, which we'll be discussing here, and also their vaccination program. So a little bit about my background. Also on the line, you have Mark O'Mara. Mark is our director of recovery at Hagerty, has been in the recovery space for over 15 years and manages our entire portfolio of recovery engagements. Throughout his career, he has managed over $15 billion in FEMA and other disaster grants. And I would be remiss in saying I've been in the business quite a long time. Mark is a true expert in navigating policy as it relates to FEMA and other programs. And so he is here with us today and will be available to answer any of the questions that you have. Also, you have John Grathwall. John is a subject matter expert with Hagerty. He comes to us from New York City's Office of Management and Budget, where not only did he manage the fiscal environment for the country's largest city, but he also navigated the city's recovery from Hurricane Superstorm Sandy. And so that was, I think, a $16 billion operation where John was the main recovery point of contact and brings a tremendous wealth of knowledge on how to navigate recovery, not only from our side in terms of trying to identify opportunities, but then also from a government perspective as well. And John has been helping us in many of the states as it relates to COVID. And then Matt Rhodes. Matt has been our lead on the engagement that we've had with Wyoming. He's been our project manager and has been in the weeds amongst all of the detail that we will get into in the presentation. So that is the group that you have in front of you. I just wanted to make sure you had an understanding of who we were and our backgrounds so that we can get into the information if that is okay with you.
Yeah, please, let's dive in.
Great. So our plan today is to talk to you, give you a little overview on the engagement, what we were doing, why we were doing it, actually get into kind of some of the results, and then also talk about going forward and where that puts the state of Wyoming in terms of COVID and the potential funds that are going to come down the road. So here's our agenda. So I think, Director Budd did a good job laying out the scenario here, but we just wanted to make sure that we just discussed this quickly. But there are multiple federal relief programs that are available as a result of COVID. Many of those were stood up for the federal government, and the government used 2 strategies. One was to create new programs, and other was to essentially use existing channels. And we saw that with FEMA, we saw that in HHS's programs, But obviously there is a recovery opportunity from a fiscal perspective for all states. 1.25 billion in the coronavirus relief fund was granted to the state of Wyoming. And like all other disasters that Hagerty has seen, where there is legislation that is introduced to help the recovery, there are policy that guides CRF, and then there's policy that was already in place that guides the other existing channels. And that is exactly the case that happened here. CRF was pushed out and tried to be as flexible as possible for state governments to create programs to deal with the response and recovery from the virus. FEMA has a long-standing tradition of their policy, but what we were advising clients early on is to try to think about it as keep all of your flexible funding and your programs that may not be eligible for FEMA in a CRF program, and make sure that all of your eligible expenses that are FEMA eligible get submitted to FEMA for reimbursement to try to maximize the CRF opportunity that is in front of you and really every other state. And so that was the idea of that strategy, and that is how we started our conversation with Director Budd. And then on top of that, FEMA has been a relatively free channel of funding for states and local governments, with $47 billion already been allocated through that program. So like Director Budd said, Hagerty we started our conversation in late summer of last year and really got underway in the fall. But we have been working with Homeland Security, the State Budget Department, and the Governor's Office on this engagement to try to get our hands around what the opportunity could be related to FEMA and what that might do or what that might present as an opportunity for reprogramming dollars into CRF. As I mentioned, our feeling based upon our knowledge and experience in the industry is that, again, the opportunity is the flexible funding, create the most advantageous programs for the state using those dollars, and then all of the eligible expenses through FEMA push through those channels. And on top of all of this, the other advantage to engaging and moving through FEMA is that they will provide a 7% management cost fee on top of the grant that you are receiving or applying for. So basically FEMA understands throughout their history that pushing millions and billions of dollars in some cases creates a fair amount of administrative burden for the recipient. And so they provide essentially a management cost to either hire or develop talent within your organization to manage, or to bring on professional services so that you can stay and remain compliant with those funds going forward. Most disasters are 10, 15-year plus recoveries. And as the committee probably knows, audit committees and organizations come in usually 3 to 5 years through the recovery. And so it's important that you have all of your information, your files kept along the way, so you can address those in a compliant fashion. So here's just a quick overview of our project. As I mentioned, we got going in the fall. And really what we were trying to do is understand what the total opportunity would be for the state, and applying our expertise on FEMA PA programs, and then understand what that would potentially result in CRF opportunities for Wyoming. And then our project plan after that point was to move in after the new year and actually pursue those dollars through grant applications, get that money back into the state, and then start the conversation about reprogramming dollars that FEMA basically is reimbursing. So just a quick recap of where we are. I've gone through most of this material already in terms of our timeline, but when we first started with the state, our number one objective was to get our hands around the data. and Director Bud was great and her team about providing us that information. It quickly became apparent that most of what we felt like would be eligible for FEMA public assistance was falling in Department of Health and OSLI. And so to really be expeditious in the matter and to use funding wisely, we basically proposed, hey, let's look at those expenditures first, try to figure out where we are, and then we can see how that may cascade going forward. And so that resulted in potentially, I think the team was looking at over $400 million and assessing that for expenses. And as I mentioned, most of that was related to health and OSLI. And here are the results. So I think the most important number here to focus on, I think what you'll probably inquire most about is the 115 million. What we did through the 424 million and condensed down, we essentially used our expertise across all of the other states that we're working on in COVID and other disasters, and came up with a rough probability of what we thought would be able to be eligible for reimbursement through FEMA. So that's what that $115 million number represents. It does not represent the finite opportunity. There's still work to be done in getting into the details on the 115 million, but with a degree of confidence, we feel that a portion of that number would be reimbursed. And so that was the real objective of the initial project, was to identify the overall opportunity. So think of that. If we were able to receive all of that funding, that money would then, the CRF that has been assigned to those dollars would be able to be reprogrammed to other programs that exist within the state or new programs going forward. And then here's a phase 2 overview. Right now, where we are is doing what I would call stakeholder management. We have been working with Homeland Security, the governor's office, and the state budget department to gain consensus on the approach going forward, specifically around the reprogramming of dollars, which again, we as a firm, Haggerty, we have seen that and have helped with that in other states that are facing some of the same issues. And so that is where we are at this point, again, working with health and OSLI. And we're continuing the next step from there. Once we gain the consensus and all of the necessary buy-in to share data and all of the next level of expense information, it would be around specific areas of focus. And so that's testing, PPE, temporary medical facilities, vaccination activity, all of the things now that FEMA has basically altered their policy and made eligible for reimbursement. The next, once we identify the actual costs, that's where our true value comes in. We're able to then help and assist Director Bud's team, which already does recovery as part of their mission. So we'll be able to augment that team and help actually formulate the grants, get those to FEMA for review, and then ultimately see the reimbursement come in for eligible expenses. And unlike other disasters, we are seeing FEMA reimburse relatively quickly on COVID-19 matters. And you can see there, so from a cash flow perspective, we're looking at 30 to 60 days based upon our other experiences across the country. And last but not least, COVID-19 continues. And so there will be more expenses and eligibility that will continue as the state responds and recovers from the event. So when we think about things retroactively, which is what the 115 is, we'll be providing the foundation to make sure that we track and seek reimbursement for those future costs going forward until we're at a steady state with the vaccine. So just some considerations for what we and how we are operating. We do and always provide knowledge transfer. So our goal is to essentially work ourselves out of a job. We want to be able to bring the team along from the state perspective in terms of what we're doing and be able to train and develop that talent so that the state can handle this going forward. As I mentioned, we've been very active in COVID-19, so we're bringing those experiences and sharing that information with the state team that we've been working with. And then last but not least, also part of our engagement is to bring software to track and manage the effort. And so this is based upon our industry knowledge and something that we have at Hagerty developed over time that is very specific to disaster grants and provides the state with reporting and management of the funds that are available so that the state is prepared later on when I mention those audits. Everything there is compliant and we're maintaining compliance along the way so that we are not spinning up an audit effort down the road. That all those files would have been prepared in the system, seeing an exact cash flow of where and tracking of where all the dollars went. And then lastly, that solution would be the property the state turned over to the state as all part of the knowledge transfer process. And so here's just some information on the engagement. We have been working under just under a $650,000 budget. We had a project plan through April. We have strategically paused that while we work through the stakeholder development that we discussed. So we are making sure that we are being cost conscious there. And then ultimately working with the state on the accounting side to make sure that once we do pursue whatever portion of the 150 million, we'll be prepared to reprogram those dollars on the back end through other CRF programs. And then last but not least, as I mentioned, there's a retroactive component of the engagement and then a proactive and future portion of the engagement. So while we have been focused to this point on everything that has happened in the past, what we'll be able to do now is make sure that going forward, we have processes in place. All of the eligibility is understood for FEMA, and we're pushing those expenses to FEMA going forward so that whatever happens with this next round of legislation, that money can be concentrated on new program development. There are many different programs that are likely to be available that are being debated now in Congress. And so if we have these processes and procedures in place to understand what the eligibility is for FEMA PA, we'll be able to not have to go through this exercise going forward. We'll have the processes in place. So with that, I will conclude the presentation. Hopefully that was informative for you, members of the committee, and we are happy to answer any questions that you have. I will probably field them, and if there are any that I want to direct to our team members, I will do that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Questions? Any questions? I'll lead off. Mr. Chairman, do you have something? Do you have a few? Okay, thank you. Just a couple questions. One of them is directly related to a comment in there. The industry-specific software that Hagerty designed and is implemented, and that becomes a property and a tool for long-term management reporting. Just interested, just out of curiosity, because we deal with a lot of IT issues. Is there a cost to maintain and do that going forward?
I will, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll turn that question to Mark to address.
Okay. You know, I've just when I look at that name and I hear Mark O'Mara, I know it's spelled differently, but I just wondering what your handicap is in golf, because Mark O'Mara was was past, I'm kidding. Go ahead, Mark.
Mr. Chairman, I put my blue jacket on today instead of the green. I appreciate the question and totally understand. And I want you to understand that Director Budd and the entire team was very sensitive to the cost and the maintenance and the overall impact that this system would have. We utilize what we call an off-the-shelf system. It is very price reasonable. It's based on the number of users per month, and the cost is about $32 per user per month. So even if you have 5 users or so, you're talking about $150 per month. It's very cost reasonable.
Are you sure that there's not a couple zeros behind that?
I'm sure.
Okay. All right. Good. Hey, I appreciate that. Thank you. That's a relief. I wanted to make sure. So as you seek reimbursement from FEMA, in many instances, in most instances, a lot of the dollars that were expended were general fund dollars. And so as there's a reimbursement, is there any kind of restriction once the reimbursement comes in? Is it basically now just general fund dollars because it's reimbursement for those general fund dollars going ahead? Or are there restrictions and limitations on the use of the FEMA reimbursement dollars?
So I will go ahead and answer this, Mr. Chairman. The way the entire FEMA public assistance program works is a reimbursement program. There are some exceptions, but the thing that's always important to mention is that the state and the subrecipients of the state who are receiving FEMA money have to actually spend the money before FEMA will reimburse it. So that is a standard and normal part of the FEMA public assistance program process. So the state can use the general fund monies, and then FEMA will reimburse that dollar amount.
And so it's just, once it comes back, it's just, they are general fund dollars. There's not a further federal restriction.
That's accurate. That is absolutely
Okay.
accurate.
Another couple of other questions. I know that, although it's a little bit different because it was COVID, there was some COVID, it wasn't necessarily FEMA, but I understand that federal auditors have descended on North Dakota to begin audit their use of coronavirus relief funds. Does Haggerty provide any, and they do that with FEMA too, as you mentioned. Does Haggerty provide any audit support when the feds show up and begin to comb through our applications and the uses of our funds?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Mr. Chairman, we approach this in multiple different ways. Number one, what we try to do is create a proactive kind of audit-ready grant file, right? We have been working in this disaster management scenario and environment for over 20 years now. And what we understand is what they're going to come look at, what the documentation requirements are, and what the compliance and timeline areas that the auditors are going to look at also include. So what we again do is we work proactively to address those issues on the front end in every way foreseeable. In addition to that, the answer to your direct question is yes. We have supported many clients throughout our 2 decades of work in audits, whether it be third-party municipal audits, single audits, or Office of Inspector General audits for either the Department of Homeland Security or the Housing and Urban Development Agency. We are very familiar with them. And I would also note that both of those FEMA and HUD OIGs are familiar with our software. And we've actually been through with their monitoring and compliance folks, all the documentation and accounting strings and everything else that we do to proactively prepare for those audits.
Are FEMA audits, are they generally a single audit, or is it generally a program specific audit? Is there a rule?
It is typically grant specific.
Okay. A couple other questions. One of them is, obviously Wyoming is a little bit of a neophyte, and as you look at where we were in our FEMA applications before Haggerty showed up and began to help us and where we are now. And so moving forward, I mean, I understand you've got to have these disaster relief declarations, they have to be accepted, and a number of things have to happen before FEMA dollars are available. But, you know, out here, we often have, you know, probably the most emergency situation, natural disasters we have in this part of the country are fire, drought, and flood, sometimes some storm. Is how much of what we've been learning and the knowledge transfer to Lynn Budd and her office and others in state government about FEMA and the application process, how much of that is applicable to other types of natural disasters when we go out and seek these natural disaster relief declarations?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'll take that one. I think it's very applicable, and I think that's what we've been cognizant of our approach and working with Director Budd's team along the way to make sure that whatever we know, Homeland Security knows as well and prepares them for future disasters. So that's a cornerstone of our approach on really every engagement we've ever been involved in with any state. is essentially set up their policies, procedures, and operations for future events, and prepare those teams with training and essentially our expertise going forward. So that will absolutely be a part of this engagement. And honestly, we've been doing that along the way with Director Budd's team to this date.
Okay, thank you. Members, other questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Vice President, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I've got a question kind of similar as far as tracking some of these other FEMA-based reimbursements. So let's use the example of fires, but we've had an experience here in Wyoming where FEMA dollars, the applications went in, funds were spent, we were reimbursed. And then a year or two later, through the audit process, they've come back and said, well, you didn't compile or you didn't complete a NEPA analysis. So now you got to give all of those funds back. And so how does your firm then interface to ensure that all the I's are checked and dotted, that we don't run into these situations where we've gone all the way through this and 2 or 3 years later, there's some deficiency in the performance on our application for reimbursement, and then they come back and say, give us the money back. How do we handle that? How do you guys deal with that? And do you provide that kind of assistance? And what's the remedy to that you guys can provide?
So, Mr. Vice President, this is Mark O'Mara. I will answer that. The answer to your question is yes, we absolutely provide that assistance. What you mentioned in the NEPA compliance is actually it's the number one reason for deobligation of federal funding is non-compliance with environmental and historic preservation requirements. The good news, if you will, relative to the COVID-19 funding, because it is not related to facilities, there is a much less chance that there will be those similar non-compliance issues for things like NEPA compliance, historical preservation, et cetera, because they're simply not applicable. Despite that reality, there are serious compliance requirements. FEMA has very stringent documentation requirements and very robust and refined processes that have been in place for over 40 years of the Stafford Act. What we do is we use our grants management system that we discussed today. That's one of the critical tools in promoting compliance. It establishes record timelines. It also establishes very clear alignment of documentation with the specific expenditures that documentation is related to. In addition, as a matter of fact and of checking, it ensures that there is not a duplication of benefits because every single dollar spent is aligned through accounting strings to the federal funding that is paying for it. So if there is a duplication of benefit where you receive $2 of federal money for $1 of expenditures, a red flag is raised and we are able to resolve that issue. So I think that the grants management tool is certainly a major component of that. In addition to that, it's experience and subject matter expertise. As I mentioned already, we try to address those issues proactively and on the front end of grant development. What commonly happens is that that those types of compliance questions are pushed to later down the road. What we try to do is address those on the front end to get FEMA approval and buy-in through the grant review process, as opposed to 1, 2, or 3 years down the road. And we've had great success in doing that as well.
Mr. Chairman, may I also make a comment to this question?
Of course you can, Director Budd.
Thank you. I do want to let you know, in addition to our work with Hagerty, we have made some staff changes within our agency to address this very issue by putting more focus of our staff time on the front end of project development and making sure that we are watching and making sure that we're providing good assistance to the applicants and helping them through the process and working with them on that front end. That's a little bit of a change in procedure for the agency. So it is specifically meant to address that particular issue that came up historically.
Thank you, Director Budd, and my good co-chairman just made a good suggestion. Use a couple of those FEMA dollars to get a better mic for your Zoom, man. You sound like you're in a basement of an undisclosed secure location. So
Well, maybe
appreciate it.
I am. Oh, that's right.
Other questions? Go ahead, Mr. Co-chair.
So what I'd like to know is, what other states are you doing this for, and how far along are you? Basically, what confidence level can you provide us with the services that you provide and the success rate on it? Just so explain that to us, please.
Sure, I can start. I'll give some statistics related to one state, and I think Mark could actually add on with another state. But we have been working with the state of Maryland since March, almost right after the quarantine began and the major push and the response began. And we've been working with them specifically on cost recovery and other services. But to date, the state has been reimbursed through FEMA for over $1 billion in eligible expenses. In addition to that, so that was everything prior to the vaccination effort. So you're thinking about all of the PPE that's being pushed out, all of the other items that are involved in the initial response to the event. We put those into the grant and submitted those and helped the state receive reimbursement through FEMA. And then in addition, we helped them. They were one of the first states, a little different in terms of geography and population than Wyoming, of course, but they set up a mass vaccination program, and we were able to generate what is called a project worksheet through FEMA for those costs. We calculated it, submitted the grant, and FEMA reimbursed it, I think, in a couple of days, which was unheard of from our experiences with FEMA to help push the vaccination effort forward and provide the necessary cash flow to do that. So that's one example from another state. Mark, I don't know if you wanted to mention Florida or maybe another.
Mark's frozen.
Mark is frozen. So it's similar. Oh, go ahead, Mark. Yep.
We are supporting Texas, California, Florida, Arkansas, South Carolina, North Carolina, Maryland, and perhaps I'm missing one or two others in cost recovery efforts related to FEMA public assistance and or COVID-19. So, I think the other important point here is we've had great success in recurring clients. And I think that speaks to your intent of the question in that, we supported the city of New York, for example, after 9/11. We were called upon by the city of New York after Sandy. And then we are now supporting them again after COVID-19. And I think that comes as a direct result of our ability to successfully navigate these complex federal reimbursement environments in which we're speaking of today.
So tell us, it looks to me like a lot of this is your need to get data from us, to input it into your system, and then to pop out the applications. How long and what do you need from us? How long is that going to take? And so where are you in the process to actually implement this with Wyoming data?
We are fairly far along in the process. The initial opportunity sizing was to understand kind of what were the expenses to date and then apply them to our base understanding of FEMA policy and eligibility. So that's what that $115 million number represents. Again, I can't, and we can't say that there's 100% confidence level there, but the confidence level is high on that. I think now what we're in the process of doing is building the stakeholder consensus about the direction that we're proposing here. And we are underway there. Once we're at that point, then yes, there will be another round of data requests so that we can get into the finer details and formulate the grants. I think we had that timeline was supposed to happen from January to April to where we would have grants formulated. We've been strategically pausing, as we mentioned, to gain the necessary consensus, but we're looking at that type of time frame. So, potentially 3-4 months.
3 or 4 months from now, with the data provided to you, the applications will be submitted. Is that fair?
That's our plan. Yes.
And then 30 to 60 days after that. So we're not talking about any reimbursements till August, till probably September, October.
That would be accurate. Mark, I don't know if you have an opinion there, but I think, yeah, we're looking at somewhere in the Q3 range.
I'll jump in. I think that is a conservative timeline, but it is 100% based on the ability to get the required documentation, to get the expenditure information from the different agencies, reviewing those for eligibility under the FEMA Public Assistance Program, working with the FEMA representatives to include those in the grants manager and grants portal process. So it is complex. There are many variables, but the first step is to start the detailed dive into the actual expenditures and the documentation so that we can protect that money for the long term, not just to put the grant together based on limited information.
I see where the president has basically directed FEMA dollars to be used to supplant COVID dollars. And so that everyone's going to be doing this. Is that accurate?
It is accurate that there are ongoing changes to the FEMA PA program, and the most specific of which is the change from a 75% federal cost share to a 100% federal cost share. That change is actually retroactive to January of 2020. So you are absolutely correct. Every applicant who has or will receive federal funding through the FEMA PA program is going to be changed from the 75% to the 100% program. In addition to that, FEMA is reviewing certain eligibility criteria, and it looks like they're going to increase eligibility of some activities. Again, perhaps retroactively, we're waiting on guidance for that. But I think your assumption is accurate that all subrecipients and recipients across the country are dealing with the same questions and opportunities that you are now.
So why you? Why can't we do it ourselves?
So I think it's a great question. I think that there are typically two reasons why states or subrecipients hire Hagerty and/or our competition. It is subject matter expertise and it is staff augmentation. This has been going on for a year already, and there are very complex realities associated with this unprecedented environment. We can bring best practices from our experiences throughout all the different FEMA regions and all of our different state clients. In addition, I think it's also very important to mention that many of these federal programs, to include FEMA Public Assistance, actually acknowledge the significant labor and effort associated with the management and administration and closeout of these grants. FEMA actually provides the state, the Department of Homeland Security, 7% of additional funding on top of the eligible dollars. So if there's $100 million of eligible FEMA PA funding, they will provide up to an additional $7 million just to manage and administer those costs, so that they acknowledge that significant effort. And that money can be used for part-time employees, force account, full-time labor, hiring of vendors and consultant support. And then many of the other federal programs have something similar as well.
So Lynn, tell us how far along you are on this and how you have sufficient personnel to put this information together. Do you need, what can we do to make, whether we use Hagerty or not, and how we go forward? What do you need?
Mr. Co-Chairman, I believe that we are doing very well at this point in time. We do have a couple of temporary positions that we have available to us should we need to supplement the work for, say, the Department of Health. If they're needing additional support to gather their information, we've already offered that up to them. Again, that cost for those temporary positions, should we need to use them, would be covered under the management funds as well. So I feel like with our partnership with Haggerty and their expertise, they've been fantastic to work with so far. I assume they will continue to be fantastic to work with. Anyway, we've learned a lot from them, and they've provided a lot of support to us. And I feel like with their partnership and looking at those temporary positions, should they become a need, will be going well as we move along.
So do we need the Leland to come back and help you administer this and get him on leave for a little bit?
I think
Get some
so,
work done?
yeah. Well, I will tell you that Deputy Director Niken is absorbing everything as quickly as he can, so.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, members? Okay, go ahead.
So on this application process, do you stack them? So you do one application, then another on each? And so are we ready? When will our first application be ready to go? I mean, it seems to me that if it's kind of subject matter related and issue related. So yeah, so how does that work?
So I will answer the question to the committee. We can actually develop multiple grants simultaneously. In the scenario that we presented, we talked most specifically about the Department of Health and OSLI. We can develop both agency grants simultaneously. And in addition to that, we can actually develop multiple grants per agency. So to the greatest extent possible, we're going to be able to utilize our efforts, our joint efforts with Department of Homeland Security and Director Budd and her staff to prioritize the highest dollar and most compliant grants to expedite the funding to the state as quickly as possible. In addition to that, FEMA does allow you to amend, or what they call version, the grants. So what we can do is actually, as I think you put it, stack the grants. Once we submit an eligible grant for, let's just say, vaccination administration or PPE, then if there's additional costs incurred, we can amend that existing grant to include any of the future costs that are similar to that original grant.
So, you talked about the other states that you're working with.
Sure.
We're the littlest guy on the block, so we're not going to be a priority for you guys because it's not as much dollars involved. So how many personnel do you have working for you? How do you keep up with the work that's in front of you, and how do we line up?
Sure, great question. I can say, first, we don't look at it from a sizing perspective. What our approach is to look at the total opportunity, which is what the step one of our engagement was for identifying the 115 million, and then understand what the requirements are to actually pursue those dollars. So every recovery that we've ever been involved in, whether it's New York City, California, which are billion-dollar engagements for those states, they all start out with a relatively small team so that we can define requirements. From that point, we then work with our clients, in this case, Director Budd and the team, to understand what skill sets we need to bring in to properly be able to complete the grant applications. So that's what we've done, and the state now has a dedicated team that has been working this engagement going back through the fall when we started. In terms of priority with the firm, I can tell you, Mark and myself are part of the firm's executive senior leadership team, and we've been involved in this engagement every step of the way. So it is certainly a priority for us, and I feel that we've definitely brought our talented folks to this engagement, and will continue to do so for the state.
Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate your attendance today and providing this information to us. I think we all learned a few things. So thank you, and I'm sure we'll probably get to see some more of you. Director Bud, anything else for us?
I believe that's all I have, sir. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this information. We appreciate it.
Okay, Lynn, and just somehow, once in a while, drop us a line and let us know how things are going, and if you need something we can do to help. Appreciate it.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I think from this point, we go on into our discussion, our continued discussion about UI, unemployment benefits, and we've got 9:05, so we're doing pretty good. Director Sessions Cooley, how are you today?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm well. How are you?
Fine. Well, yeah. So anyway, we've got the slide deck that I guess it's that way. And we've got that slide deck that you sent over to us. Are you going to take us through that, or it looks like you've got a number of your team there? So please go ahead. If you want to make some introductory remarks and pass it off, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee, it's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Robin Sessions Cooley, and I am the Director of Wyoming Workforce Services. So I do have a number of the real experts in the office with me, and I'd like to first introduce you to them, as they are really going to be getting into the nuts and bolts of the questions you've asked and the information you need today. First is Holly McCamey-Simone, Administrator of our Workforce Programs. Next, we also have Chris Funk, who is our Deputy Administrator in our tax section, and Kristen Burkhart, who is our CFO. But before we dig into the presentation, I would really like to set the stage for you around the issues that you've discussed and want more information on. I first want to make sure you know that the actions taken by this legislature and Governor Gordon are the actions that could be taken under our current laws to try to affect employer tax rates in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. These actions, by providing an influx of CARES Act dollars and providing the ability through the Senate File 2 from the special session, and providing the ability of the governor to non-charge certain employers, did make a difference for employers. Did it result in no tax increases? No, it didn't. And if you look at the statutory, which are really genius statutory factors in our legislation, it would really be an impossibility to do that. But it did make a difference. Administrator McCamey-Simone will explain the reasons for that, which relate to the various statutory factors I just mentioned that all play a role in determining the tax rates for employers. But second, I also want you to, or I would ask you to recognize that the actions taken also protect the tax rates for these employers in the future. Please remember that in your consideration of these issues, that all of these factors impact future years. So we are always asking ourselves about an impact to employers several years down the road. It's not just the immediate need for keeping that tax rate low, but it's also recognizing that all of these things have a consequence down the road for future tax years. It is our job, and we work diligently to keep the fund healthy to ensure that businesses and employees alike are protected for future years without the need to obtain loans from the federal government, which several of our surrounding states have had to do this past year, and we will provide you with that information. Please remember that if we do have to get loans from the federal government, the costs of these loans at some point have to be passed on to employers. So keeping our hands on that to keep the fund healthy for the benefit of employers, to keep these rates low now and into the future is one of our main concerns. So with those introductory comments, I would like to hand you off to Administrator McCamey-Simone to provide you with some general information around how tax rates are calculated. Then CFO Burkhart and Deputy Director Funk will speak to you about the specific questions that you've raised. Holly, you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Director Cooley. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Holly McCamey-Simoni, the Workforce Programs Administrator and UI Director. I believe you have a copy of my presentation. I am going to try to share my screen here. Okay, are you seeing my screen okay? Okay. Got one more thing I gotta move here. There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to give you an overview of UI tax rates, the process and what's taken place, and then pull in Kristen Burkhart, CFO, and Chris Funk, UI Tax Chief, to speak to your specific questions. It's important to note that this overview is focused solely on how regular unemployment tax rates are set. The newly created CARES UI programs are being fully reimbursed by the federal government and don't factor into the employer tax rates. We hope that will clear up exactly how CARES Act monies and the non-charge provision impacted Wyoming employer rates. So we're going to start from the top and talk about what is a base rate. New employers have a standard rate based on industry classification system, and that's our NAICS codes. A new employer receives the standard rate for 3 years until they have established their experience rate. Basically, an employer's layoff history determines their experience rating. And experience rated employers are those that have a minimum of 3 years of taxable wage history. The more layoffs incurred, the more impacted the experience rate will be, and therefore the higher the tax rate will be for the employer. Experience rates and base rates are only one component of the UI tax rate calculation. Many times employers call our division and as if we're insurance agents and ask if we can give them a discount. That is not the case, as the following factors are all set in statute and strictly dictate how Wyoming employers are taxed. An employer's total tax rate is determined by the base rate plus these 3 factors you see here: the non-charged ineffectively charged factor, the employment support fund factor, and the fund balance factor. So let's start with the non-charged ineffectively charged factor. The factor replenishes the fund for employers who are at the maximum experience rate or for other reasons laid out in the statute. The next factor is the employment support fund factor, which is a small percentage that supplements funding for Wyoming's workforce centers, which help people get back into the workforce and obtain jobs. The third factor is the fund balance factor. So this can be thought of as a trigger which activates those higher taxes when the UI trust fund falls below a certain amount. So let's talk about the recent actions by the legislature and Governor Gordon and discuss how they are helping Wyoming employers. We're going to start with the CARES Act funding and the UI trust fund. So the CARES Act funds and the executive order helped employers in 2 ways. The first CARES Act tranche helped to pay for the actual non-charging of Wyoming employers, and this put the experience rates for employers on ice for COVID-19 related claims for those businesses who qualified under the executive order. As an overall measure, the initial and future tranches of funds will help with fund solvency and helps to keep employer tax rates steady. So let's look at the impact of the executive order and the non-charge provision a bit closer. The executive order froze experience rates for employers listed in the executive order who had to close due to the public health orders. This allowed the department to non-charge the employer based on those public health orders. The special session legislation authorized the governor to issue an executive order to non-charge Wyoming employers. The CARES Act funding assisted in paying for those non-charges that you see here on the screen so far. Okay, so in review, the non-charge provision helped businesses who closed due to the public health orders. This primarily benefited employers who had to close or adjust their business practices due to the public health orders. The tranche of CARES Act money resulted in a more solvent UI fund, preventing the solvency trigger or fund factor going below a certain amount and automatically triggering higher taxes. And this action benefited all employers who pay UI taxes. As it pertains to the UI system, we feel the governor and the legislature did everything within their power to help Wyoming employers during these challenging times. Neither the tranche of CARES Act funds nor the non-charging can ensure no rate increases because of the other factors that are within the tax rate computation that we are unable to impact. Economic conditions often trigger a higher rate schedule with higher minimum and higher maximum rates. For Wyoming, the total maximum rate will never be more than 10% by law. Drawing from the UI Trust Fund triggers across the board taxes that are meant to maintain solvency of the UI Trust Fund. These factors are outlined in state statute and strictly dictate how tax revenues are collected. DWS does not feel that there are other actions available to us that would not potentially compromise the fund solvency and or freeze tax rates for now, but bigger, higher tax rates in the future. And ultimately, that's kicking the can down the road. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. That was a quick run through for you. Please let me know if you have any additional questions. And then I have a couple more experts here that can speak to your specific questions.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm curious how you calculate the solvency of the fund. What is the appropriate amount in there? What's too much, too little?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that's a wonderful question, and I'm going to see if Ms. Funk or Ms. Burkhart is available to answer that.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee. Since Kristen did not speak up, I guess this one comes to me. The statute is very specific that we take the balance of the trust fund as of October 31st of the year prior to the new rate year. And it takes a look at and compares the balance of the trust fund with the total covered wages for the prior fiscal year. That's how the statute is written. If it falls under 3.5% of the covered wages that are used in the calculation, if that balance falls under that amount, then the employers get a positive fund balance factor. That's because the trust fund is lower and the fund balance factor is going to collect the taxes and the revenue that we need to increase the trust fund to get it back up to where we need it to be. If the trust fund balance is more than 4% of those covered wages, the employers actually get a negative trust or a negative fund balance factor. That is true for the last 2 years. So in 2019, 2020, I believe also in 2017, employers had experience rated employers had a negative fund balance factor. So in that slideshow that Holly provided to you, there were 3 factors. And when the fund balance factor is a negative, it doesn't necessarily give a credit back to the employer. But what it does is it offsets part of the other 2 factors, the non-charge and effectively charged and the employment support fund factor. So it doesn't really give them a credit back, but it reduces the amount of taxes. Because the on with the economy and with COVID last year, the fund balance was below that 3.5%. Therefore, employers did get a positive fund balance factor. The total of all of the factors for 2021 was the same that it was in 2014. It is actually still less than it was following the recession in 2009 and reached over 0.60%, I believe, in 2011 or 2012. So unfortunately, we had the lowest rate factor total in 2020 historically. So because the trust fund was doing well and unemployment was low. But then when everything hit last year in 2020, it did impact the trust fund balance and it went under the 3.5%. How that was determined, I'm not quite sure, but that was written in statute years ago.
Thank you.
So it's interesting because we understand this, but I don't know if we understand anything. What we don't know is how many employers it benefited and how much money it saves them. And so in other words, we need to be able to quantify what the dollars that we put in have and how it's impacted employers in Wyoming. And so the trust fund, what's got 4-point-some billion dollars in it? I'm trying to, I saw the numbers yesterday. I can't remember what they are, but how do we tell people we put this money in there and here's the benefit? I mean, regardless of how you characterize the three pots, tell us how to explain this to people and what the benefit of us is and why we should be concerned or add money or if we did the right thing. Help us explain it.
So I believe the trust fund balance as of January 31st was
Chris, it's $280.4 million as of the end of January.
280 million, and it's been roughly that amount or a little bit more for the last 5 years, right?
That's the lowest it's been since March of 2017. So it's usually up in the 300,000s, high 300,000s. In the last year, it's, consistently gone down.
And so, and then I see the numbers of what you're paying out per month or per quarter, but we don't really have comparisons that for the prior 5 years. I think we need to understand that. In other words, how do we know what the real COVID impact was on those funds in comparison? And was it the COVID impact that caused it? I mean, can we say that? How do we express it and be honest and truthful about it?
So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I can tell you that in the package that you received yesterday, on page 7 through 9, it'll show you for the last 60 months, the monthly amount of payments, benefit payments that were made out to the unemployed. That's broken down into regular UI, which is the blue column. That's the only money that impacts our trust fund itself. Then there's orange and green columns. Those are all the federal programs that we've also paid out. Those we get federally reimbursed by USDOL or from FEMA. And so those don't impact our trust fund. So you can see for fiscal year 2020, we paid out a total of $116.6 million in regular UI benefits, which is significantly higher than fiscal year 2019 and prior years. It's comparable to fiscal year 2016, as you can see, but still slightly higher.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and thank you for those numbers, but if I go back to your memo and go to page 2, you flip over, it basically says is because of the recession, let's just call it the downturn in mineral prices, which are indirectly related to COVID, that you're not able to tease those out. Because we had significant layoffs, at least in my area, that were more related to minerals prices, but the minerals prices were a double whammy of competition with the geopolitical prices with oil, and then the decrease in the economy. But those are indirect, at least one of those is indirect relationship of COVID. And so it would appear to me that is it even possible to tease out the direct and the indirect unemployment claims that were paid out under the scenario that we had the big downturn in mineral prices also?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Rob.
Mr. Vice President, I think what you're speaking to is the very issue that we faced when we were looking at Senate File 2 and the direction that we had there to try to adjust some of those rates, but also try to maintain the health of the trust fund. So if you look at the legislation, it speaks to directly, we needed to outline the basis for the order in the executive order with the adoption of adequate standards and safeguards to assure the continued actuarial soundness of the unemployment compensation trust fund. So what we did was we really had our charge from you to make sure that we made some impact, but also ensured the health of that fund, not only now, but for the future. So what we did, and I think in the earlier presentation, we talked about only providing a break on some of these charges if there was a public health order, but also we did provide a break for those individuals where there was an illness in the workplace requiring isolation or quarantine of one or more employees. So what we related the Senate File 2 to is not necessarily the recession issues you're talking about. We related it to the COVID issues because we felt those were the only ones we could really quantify and put some parameters around to ensure the health of that fund, while also providing some non-charging benefit. I think that with the charge that you gave us in Senate File 2, we really were trying to draw those lines where it was not at our discretion. We had a clear dividing line where we could non-charge and where we couldn't. And those were the clear dividers that we could come up with that made sense for these purposes. So I understand your question, but I don't think that was something that we felt the order really related to.
Bouncing around on pages.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Director Cooley. So with that, I think the intent that we all understood is that we were trying to protect the balance of the fund and to try to mitigate any increases to the employers moving forward as a means of helping them. And then as allowed by the COVID guidance to not charge if they were COVID related unemployment costs. And so with that said, with what we put back into the unemployment fund as allowed through the CARES money, certainly impacted the overall health of the fund, and certainly impacted the to the benefit of all employers, regardless of whether it was whether they have any COVID-related expenses or not, because it added back to the health of the fund. And on the non-charged ineffective factor, and both also on the fund balance factor, am I seeing that incorrectly?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's accurate. Chris, you can correct me on that. What we did actually did assist all employers, recognizing that the individuals that fell within the parameters of the executive order, I believe, were assisted to a larger degree. Is that correct, Chris?
Director Cooley, that is correct. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I actually I think I know what you're looking for here. We had provided information to the governor's office, and I apologize that we didn't provide this to you. We actually had spoken about the cost savings for, and what the decrease in the rate, the result of the rate was because of the 25 million. So I just put some figures together. And so what I did was, I'll have to explain this, but it is a little bit complicated. So in the fund balance factor, years ago, after the fund balance factor was created, it was also identified later that there was, the law was changed to allow a bigger break to employers who had no claims history in the last 3 years. So there was a grouping that was set up. There's a group 1, and that's for employers that have, new employers or employers that have had a benefit history in the last 3 years. And then there's what's called group 2, and that's just employers that had no history of claims in the last 3 years. And I'm sure the thought is if they had no claims, there was no administrative cost, there was no cost or no benefit charges. So when you look at group 1 and group 2, the what I did was the taxable wages for fiscal year 2020 were just over $5 million. So I did an estimate, and I took that $5 million, and 34% of all employers still in 2021 had a 0 experience rate. They had no benefit charges, even during 2020, which we thought was kind of remarkable, that there were 34% of all employers that were able to keep their businesses open, keep their employees working. They were able to pay them salaries. And 66% were either new employers or they had some kind of benefit charges in the last 3 fiscal years, not necessarily just in 2020, but in the last 3 fiscal years. So I took that $5 million, and I for the group 2 or the employers with no experience history, I took that 5 million times 34% of those wages, and this is totally an estimate. And I figured out the decrease in the rate factor, because we had provided to the governor's office the difference in the factor. So their factor is 0.10% right now. Their factor would have been 0.11% without that 25 million. I took that 0.01% difference, and it came up to $1.7 million that were saved. That is a smaller percentage of the employers, and their factor is lower because they have less experience rate or experience history as far as benefit charges. I also took that 5 million and took it times the other 66%. Their rate decrease because of the 25 million was 0.013%. So if we didn't put that 25 million in there, their rate would have been 0.013 higher than it was. And I took that times the taxable wages, the 66%, and it is $43 million. So we're actually that 25 million in the trust fund saved all employers, and estimated, please know that it's estimated, but it's right around $45 million. So,
well, Mr. Chairman, if I could follow up on that, that really is kind of the information that I've been searching for. And Mr. Chairman, I think as we looked as a legislature to say, how can we positively impact businesses, small or large, through the state, being able to help them not have increases in their experience in their unemployment insurance is a great benefit. It's one that impacts all of them. And so my request then, Director Cooley, as this committee is going to be mulling over these next COVID dollars, however they roll out, is what can we do? What would it take to give us the most benefit to businesses by an infusion of additional money into the UI fund? It will impact some businesses more than others, but I think, as you just evidenced, it's going to impact all businesses positively. And so what would your recommendations be if funding was available to further help do this without exceeding the amount that we can put in the corpus? I know that there's a limit that we can put in, but what can we do? That information, I think, would help provide us some guidance in the decisions that we need to make here in the next 60 days.
And what did the 39 million do? We need to know that number. And then can you explain when you say it doesn't include federal dollars as part of your calculation, and why not? And how much money are you talking about? And how does that impact the overall numbers?
Mr. Chairman, may I follow up on that question?
You can always follow up on those questions.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, can you please explain that one to me? I think when Administrator McCamey-Simone was speaking, I think what we wanted to make clear are the PUA, the PEUC, the FPUC, the LWA, all of those special programs. Those programs were a complete aside to all of these issues that we're discussing today. They were separately paid. They were separately awarded. What we're talking about here today is, with some of these numbers, is just our UI trust fund. So you have UI trust fund payments, but then you have all these other things as well. Those are separate from this discussion. So I'm not sure what it was that your question related to.
So what we want to know is if you got additional federal dollars from COVID relief for those other programs, how much was it? What benefit did it provide and to the folks in Wyoming? The UI is one issue, but if there's other things out there that's been provided that has been a benefit, we'd like to be able to articulate that as well and understand them. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That makes it clear that those were significant dollars that came in, and we can definitely parse that out for you about those amounts, who it went to, and what the benefits were to different segments of our communities.
Well, yeah, Robin, and it's just my penchant to restate the obvious, but if I understood your comments earlier, I mean, ultimately that 25,000 really had a multiplier effect. It almost doubled that kind of benefit to employers out there. And I don't know exactly how you go about doing that, but we're trying to figure out is if we have the opportunity and the discretion to allocate these dollars where they'll do the most good, we're just trying to find out where the biggest bang for the buck. And I know that's a difficult task, and it may be somewhat by, really just may not be necessarily be empirically able to determine that. But even if it's just by your feeling or the seat of our pants to help us know where, if we have the opportunity to put additional COVID dollars, where will we get the biggest bang for our buck and which of the programs that we have are out there? I mean, that's what we're trying to get at. That makes sense?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That makes perfect sense. We were speaking yesterday about this issue, and we've got a healthy trust fund, and it's millions and millions of dollars. So we speak to adding 25 million, we speak to adding 39 million. And I think there's got to be a recognition that for the size of the fund that we've got, that's a relative, and it's hard for me to say this, that's a relatively small amount, right? But it did make a difference. So we'll speak to that and get some smart minds around that discussion and get you some information on it for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Director or anyone of the team, I guess. I just want to make sure as I read the narrative, and I understand what you say about the amounts are relatively small, but I know that you're going to go after, as the federal dollars come in this new act, you're going to go after whatever you can go after, and they'll reimburse to you what is reimbursable. What I'm looking for is, for right now, going forward, say in the next short term, of this 39 million, do you see that as an imperative for you right now, or based on what you see on the horizon, is there some wiggle room there? As I read this, it sounds like, to me, like the 25 million and how it tracks through was a big help. And the 39 million, while helpful, maybe it's actually more than we need right now in that program at this moment, given where we are. Am I missing something?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I don't think you're missing anything. In some of the information we've provided you, we've spoken to how many years do we have of benefits ahead of us, given a certain amount of unemployment insurance, what the unemployment level is, and given certain parameters around it. And we've got, under one scenario, 1.8 years. Under another scenario, we've got 4 years. So the 39 million makes a difference. Is it imperative right now? I mean, I would have to say no, because we've got these clear numbers that are indicating we have several years of unemployment insurance monies that can be paid out. So, but Chris, can you speak to what the impact of that would be if we don't have that other influx? Does that cause you any significant concern right now?
Director Cooley, Mr. Chairman and Co-Chairman, I think what we probably really need to know is the purpose of what you really want to do. When I'm looking at the figures, because we had done an estimate on putting the 39 million in and how it would affect the fund balance factor again. Because primarily the only factor of the three that are impacted by the actual trust fund is the fund balance factor. And to be honest with you, I was surprised when I was doing this just now. We had done an estimate, and an additional 31 million would drop that factor enough, or 39 million would drop it at about 31 million. So logically, if you take 25 million and you take 39 million and you compare the two, you would think that 39 would be considerably more, but it's kind of interesting how the factor works, because what happens is when you put that 39 million and you hit that margin between that 3.5% and that 4%, and it's not going to drop anymore until it hits high enough to go into a negative. So it might be worth it for us to look at what it would take to get us back to zero, to get the employers back to a zero factor rate. It's still not going to be as low as it was last year, but I don't know that I think you already figured it out, that the 39 million may not be what we need to lower that. We would have to converse with USDOL, but we could, I think we're at the point where we can be creative. They did tell us that we can deposit money into the trust fund, and we can calculate the rate based on considering that deposit prior to, but we would have to really look at the numbers and look to see what is the most advantage. But I honestly, the 39 million, if we're looking at just the fund balance factor, I don't know. The problem is that as soon as
Mr. Chairman. So Ms. Funk, we appreciate the complexity of the calculations that you're providing for us, but our question is really quite simple. And that's, what do we do to provide the best benefit to the employers to prevent them from having to have any increases? And we'd like to have that information come back to us. You know, if the 39 million is inconsequential, does it take $150 million to do that? You know, just, you know, tell us what it is we need to do to really make that difference. That's all we're asking.
Mr. Chairman. And I'm kind of with Representative Larson, but I think I've been able to figure out what the answer to that question is based on the memo they've already provided. And so let me see if I can characterize what I think the memo says. And the memo says is the 39 million will help just a little bit. Just a little bit for the short term, because it's the other factor you got to calculate in is the 1.8 versus the 4 years. So in the short term, it's not going to have a big impact on employers' payment in their unemployment insurance payments. That's the way I read it. I think it's pretty clear because of the factor that we're talking about. And I got whatever the numbers are. It doesn't change that much. So you may still, but what it does is if you take that out and say, well, you know, we're actuarially 4 years, it will have some longer benefits. Is that the way? That's what I'm getting from your memo. So the 39 has a very short impact in the immediate, but if we take that out, it's going to have some benefit 4 years out also. Is that correct? Based on the 1.8 years in the memo that says if we leave it at the current level and don't do the 39 million, look to me the way this is drafted is there's enough in the trust to cover 1.8 million or 1.8 years. If we do the 39 million, that kind of guarantees us there's enough in the trust for 4 years. Is that correct?
I can clarify just a little bit on that. So the 1.8 years is at the current benefit paid out for 2020 if we don't take into consideration any tax collections at all. Now, if we add tax collections in there that we have estimated for 2021, the solvency of that trust fund goes out to 4 years. So that doesn't even take into consideration the dumping of the 39 million into the trust fund.
So one of the other things is, I was going to ask a question a little bit different vein. Does anybody wanted it? So then also, anyways, I was looking at and thank you for the 60-month review of those payments. I think, just kind of eyeballing that and getting some trends. One of my questions for as you look at and as we anticipate, what do you see happening in 2021 as far as the claims history? I mean, it looks like maybe we're trending down, but it's hard to know because it's winter and there's always more UI claims in the winter. But you just mentioned you had some estimates for 2021. What do you see as in 2021 as compared to 2020 on UI claims?
I'd have to go back. I mean, we have an economics team in RMP that put together a lot of projections. So I'll have to go back and look to see what, I'm sure they have some projections on that, Chris, I'm not sure. But I'm sure we can get you the estimates or the projections that they're using for benefits paid and revenues collected based on the current tax rate, and that meaning also relying on the number of employers staying stable as well. So I think we could get you some of those projections. I know we have people that run those projections all the time. So,
And are you getting any kind of feel for how, and it's hard, I think it's going to be hard over the next little while to differentiate between pandemic and other economic factors such as the inability, the federal moratorium on drilling, on hydrocarbon leasing on federal lands and things like that, which all will have, I think, ultimately effects on that. But are we even close to being to where we're starting to see UI claims attributable to the pandemic start to tail off, or do you have any feel for that at all yet?
I don't know if Chris would know that or not.
Mr. Chairman and Co-Chairman, when we had made a change to our system that when a claimant filed a claim, they were given a question to answer if their claim was COVID related. Unfortunately, we found that a lot of individuals were claiming COVID when it may not have been directly related to COVID. We did track that, but unfortunately, the burden is up to the claimant to be honest, and it could depend on their opinion about whether or not it's actually COVID or not. We could look at those numbers, but without investigating every single claim, unfortunately, we really have without reaching out to the employer, I don't know that we really know, but we could look at some of those numbers and see if the responses that they're giving has dropped, if that would help.
I think it might, but for example, and this is what I'm trying to figure out. If we look at 2020 last year, if we look at March, April, May, June, particularly April, May, and June, I mean, you see just, very large, particularly in June, very, very large UI payouts. And we know why that was. And I'm wondering, will we see the same types of things through there? I mean, I think that I think come June, July, I'm hoping that we're starting to see this tail off a bit, but I don't know. And I'm wondering if you all have, or what's your expectation, or if you have any kind of expectation of preparing for additional work or additional UI claims to process those as they come through over the next 4 or 5 months.
Mr. Chairman, I'll speak to that. I think it's our expectation that those are going to go down. However, what we're keeping our eye on federal legislation, which is a little bit concerning because that federal legislation is going to ramp up these same or similar programs again, which I mean, it's going to put us in the same, it's not going to incentivize people to, I mean, there's going to be some inclination to just move forward and continue getting that money. So with these new programs coming in, that may not actually pan out with what we think should be happening, which is fewer claims being filed.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator Kinski.
Thank you. I hope my question is germane. I've been out of it a little bit, but you asked what is it that we're looking for. I'd repeat, I think I alluded to it in the prior meeting. When we worked on this legislation initially, it said it was for employers who were impacted by orders to close. And we then modified that in the legislative course to say employers are ordered to close or whose business was affected by the crisis. And there's a young man in Sheridan that he had his best January, February ever, and he was not ordered to close. He manufactures posters, caps, T-shirts for events. Every event was canceled, and he was stuck with $180,000 in inventory. He had to lay all 35 employees off. I said, "What about the PPP?" And he said, "Well, we have nothing to do. I mean, I can keep him on payroll, but we have nothing to do. We have no business left." And so gradually he's been able to rebuild. Well, now he got notice of what his unemployment rate is, and it's not very favorable because he laid everybody off for a period of time, is there, so not, I'm not seeking relief for all employers, just particular employers. Is there an appeals process? Is there's some place he can go to seek some sort of relief, or would you need something from us in legislation that says, okay, in those kinds of circumstances, it's okay to give them unemployment relief? And I think that ought to be far less costly than giving relief to every single employer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski, Chris can speak to this as well. I think we've heard a lot of the same or similar instances from employers where they weren't in a situation where they needed to close, but they closed for health reasons, concerns over their employees, whatever the circumstance might be. When we looked at the language of Senate File 2, we had to have some kind of a defining line. If we had employers that closed in a voluntary type situation to keep employees safe, or because, and the situation you indicated might be a little different. His was a mandate to close because he just, the product that he was developing, there wasn't a place to actively sell that product out there. But, we are afraid of opening this up further because that's going to be leaving it to our discretion to a large degree. And that's going to open this up far wider than I think that we want it to go. If we can put clear parameters around that, then yes, I recognize what you're saying, and maybe that's something we need to think about. I also want to note that in the governor's executive order, he was very clear about leaving this open for further amendments down the road as we got more information about some of these impacts. So maybe that's something we can look at, but we're in a situation where we needed at this point to have a fine line to draw where it wasn't at our discretion. And so it depended on which employee that you got within unemployment insurance that would make that discretionary determination. We don't want to do that. We want it to be a fine line. As to an appeal, absolutely, they have an appeal. When they get their tax rate, they have the opportunity to go in and appeal what that rate is. And Chris, I don't know how many appeals you've received, but I think it's been quite a few around that particular issue. So that opportunity is there as well. So we would be happy to work with you on some parameters around those types of circumstances. But I will tell you, it was very difficult to come up with a way that we felt was supportable and that kept the fund healthy as required by your legislation.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman, I would like to add some information. Everything Director Cooley said is correct. I actually do the annual rate process. I handle the appeals. I have had hundreds. I've had a lot of conversations with employers, and many conversations have been exactly what you just said. It was the lost revenue. They've offered to send me their income statements. They've offered to do a lot of things, and I have empathy for them completely because I understand. It's all relative, what you're saying and what was stated earlier about not increasing employer rates. And feasibly, the only way that we could go back and not have an increase is for an influx of money that would make up for everything that happened. So I had asked the other day for a total of all of the benefit charges that were used for rating purposes from fiscal year 2020, and it was $91 million. I would guess, I apologize, I don't have the total for just first and second quarter. So fiscal year obviously went through June 30th. I don't have the total for just that period, but I would venture to guess a majority of that 91 million is from first and second quarter. For employers to not have a rate increase at all, we would have to make up that $91 million. we would also have to make up for the increase in the other factors. We would have to have enough money to make up for the other factors, the computation of the other factors. So our total non-charges that were used, and what non-charges are as Holly showed in her slide, is when an employer is not charged for various reasons. Non-charge was 14 million, and the ineffective charges was almost 5 million. So we're looking at 20 million there. So in order for us to be able to lower their rates and not have long-term impact, we would have to replace all of the dollars that were spent and are now incorporated into the rates, if that helps. The problem is it's, as Director Cooley said, it's really hard to go from this group that was already identified to somewhere in between that group and everyone. And everyone does have an appeal right, but what I do inform them is that the appeal is basically going to be, a hearing officer is going to look at the law and determine if the rate was calculated correctly and by law. And I review every one of them to make sure it's correct first. If they still want to appeal, then I pass it along. But unfortunately, the hearing officer doesn't have the discretion to not follow the law. And at this point, we have the law and we have the executive order. So if that helps at all, that's basically where we are.
I still don't quite understand what 91, that if it's, let's say it's 91 million, what is the benefit to all employers and how long does it last?
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman, when we non-charge the employers from the executive order, we non-charged those amounts permanently. So those charges, because the 25 million helped replenish the fund, and I believe we showed those figures as about 5 to 6 million, and then we don't know fourth quarter yet as we haven't finalized that. Because that 25 million recouped that, we eliminated those benefit charges for those employers permanently. If we were able to non-charge these employers because we could recoup that money back into the fund, then we could non-charge them permanently for the 91 million. And what the 91 million is, again, is when we did the rate calculation, the total for all experience rated employers that we charged benefit charges in fiscal 2020 was $91 million. So if we had that money deposited back in and we non-charge those individuals, those charges would not show up on their rate permanently.
So I think maybe I just had a light go on. Maybe this is the reason why the 25 million that was deposited back in September has such a large effect. Is it because it basically covered in full the non-charged and effectively charged numbers? Is that a part of the relationship?
Mr. Chairman and Co-Chairman, we didn't necessarily compare it that way. If we would have to go back and figure out exactly how the 25 million impacted. Now, the problem is if you say that it wipes out the non-charge and ineffective charge, you have to, so let's see if I can explain this. So the fund balance factor, as I explained earlier, was like 45 million that they saved, right, from the 25 million. That was to recoup 45 million of lost revenue or lost funds in the trust fund because of claims paid out. So we can't really use that 25 million in several different places, if that makes sense. We can say of the 25 million, it helped to cover for the benefit charges for those that we non-charge, which was between 5 and 6 million, I believe. That leaves about 20 million.
Right, okay. So.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just, it's more coincidental than, and not necessarily causal. But going back to the non-charged and the ineffectively charged numbers, when you do that, and so they're not specifically charged against the employer, but they are charged against basically the fund as a whole, aren't they? I mean, they do deplete the fund, and so ultimately, it does, like we talked about before, it just avoids an experience factor, but it may end up having a fund balance factor that you have to impose to recover that because they weren't specifically charged against an account. So I get that relationship. It's actually time to go back to work. It's past time to go back to work. Does there anybody have any specific thing else? I think we've whipped out. Actually, even though we're muddled around here and we're still, in a little bit of midst of a haze about this, so a couple things have come clear, and so anyway, we may have some further questions and discussions for you, but we appreciate the information. It's very, actually, believe it or not, we're still digesting it, but I think it's going to be, and it is to me, very helpful. So thank you for that. And we'll go ahead and we'll adjourn and go back to work. Thanks for your time, Director. Appreciate you and your staff. And as far as we know, you guys are geniuses, but
As far as we don't know.